I knew moving onto my grandfather's farm would ruffle some suburban feathers, but I wasn't expecting to be accused of running an underground power grid within my first 6 months. 15 acres of open land, a red barn that had stood for generations, and the kind of peace and quiet you can only get when your nearest neighbor isn't close enough to hear you yell at a stubborn goat. It should have been paradise. Instead, it was a battlefield, and at the center of it stood Karen, the self-appointed dictator of the local HOA. Now, technically, I wasn't part of the HOA. The neighborhood had expanded toward my family's land years ago, but my grandfather had never sold out. He kept his farm, his livestock, and his independence, much to the growing annoyance of the ever-pristine beige-loving suburbanites who had to gasp live near a real farm. When I inherited the place, I thought I could live peacefully. I was wrong. Karen had been trying to tighten her iron grip on my farm since the day I moved in, starting with petty complaints. My fences weren't HOA approved, my barn clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. My chickens had the audacity to make chicken noises in the morning. But when all of that failed, she started digging deeper. And that's when things got weird. IT started small. Flickering lights in my barn, power tools stuttering, my security cameras cutting out randomly. At first, I blamed it on old wiring. This place had been standing since my great-grandfather's time, and while I'd upgraded most of it, there were still quirks. But then I noticed something stranger. My electric bill. I'm not one to scrutinize my utility bills like some kind of conspiracy theorist, but after 2 months of bizarre surges, I took a closer look. My usage had nearly doubled. Now, I have a farm, but I'm not running a data center out of my barn. Something wasn't right. So I did what any rational person would do. I turned everything off. The entire property. Flipped the main breaker and let my land go dark. Except, my meter kept running. I stood there in the moonlight, staring at the little dial spinning like a hamster on espresso. Someone was stealing my power. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the property, looking for anything unusual. That's when I spotted the trench. It was subtle, covered by grass that had been carefully laid back down, but I knew my land like the back of my hand. And this was new. A cable, one that I hadn't installed, ran underground from my barn toward the row of cookie-cutter McMansions on the other side of my property line. I didn't even need to guess where it was going. Karen. Of course, she wasn't personally out here with a shovel, but she was the kind of person who thought property lines were mere suggestions. So, I followed the line, because if someone was bold enough to steal from me, I was going to be bold enough to catch them in the act. I didn't have to walk far. The cable led right to a freshly built wooden fence that separated my farm from the neighborhood. And wouldn't you know it? There was a hole in the bottom just big enough for a thick electrical cable to slip through. I stared at the fence, then at my barn, then back at the fence. She wasn't just trying to police my land. She was literally siphoning my power. Now, I could have called the power company right then and there. Or the police. But honestly, I was too entertained to stop just yet. Instead, I grabbed a pair of wire cutters, snipped the line, and left a friendly little note where the cable had been. Nice try. Next time, pay your own damn bill. Then I sat back and waited. It didn't take long. That evening, just as I was finishing up in the barn, I heard it. A shriek of pure, unfiltered rage. Karen. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on my jeans, just in time to see her marching toward my gate like an HOA general going into battle. She was dressed in her usual power outfit. Blazer, pearls, a clipboard clutched in her iron grip like it was some kind of legal Excalibur. You, she spat the moment she saw me. Me, I said cheerfully. Her face was red enough to match my barn. Do you have any idea what you've done? I leaned against the fence. Oh, you mean cutting the illegal power line running from my farm to your neighborhood? Yeah, I had a little free time today. Karen's jaw worked like she was trying to chew through the sheer injustice of being caught. That was a legally sanctioned community initiative. I raised an eyebrow. You mean theft? It was redistribution. Some of our homes have been experiencing terrible outages, and as a good neighbor, I took it upon myself to ensure that. I held up a hand. Karen, you literally dug an illegal power line onto my land and stole my electricity. Karen huffed. Well, if your property wasn't such a drain on the aesthetic appeal of this community, maybe we wouldn't have had to take matters into our own hands. I had to give it to her. She never admitted fault. But before I could respond, we heard the sound of sirens. Both of us turned as 2 police cruisers pulled into my driveway, red and blue lights flashing. Karen crossed her arms, Smugness returning. Good. I called them to deal with your illegal tampering with community resources. I chuckled. Funny. Because I called them to report electricity theft. Karen's smile froze. And just like that, the night was about to get a whole lot more interesting. The police officers stepped out of their cruisers, their faces unreadable as they took in the sight before them. One fuming HOA dictator, one farm owner leaning way too casually against his fence, and a whole lot of neighborhood drama waiting to explode. The lead officer, a tall, no-nonsense guy with a badge that read Sergeant Miller, took a deep breath like a man who already regretted answering this call. Okay, he said, glancing between us. Who wants to tell me what's going on? Karen, never one to let logic interfere with her plans, shoved her way forward, clipboard clutched like a weapon. Officer, thank goodness you're here. I need you to take immediate action against this criminal, she jabbed a finger in my direction, who has unlawfully tampered with vital neighborhood infrastructure. I blinked. Vital neighborhood infrastructure? Karen, you stole my power. She gasped like I'd slapped her with a wet fish. I did no such thing. The Homeowners Association simply took reasonable, necessary steps to ensure the continued functionality of our community. I turned to Miller. Translation: they ran a secret power line from my barn to their houses, and when I cut it, she lost her mind. Miller rubbed his temples like he could already feel the migraine forming. Is that true, ma'am? Karen scoffed. That's an outrageous accusation. This is just another attempt by Mr. Carter to stir up drama. If anything, he's the one stealing from us. His unsightly operation lowers property values daily. Behind Karen, a few neighbors had gathered at the edges of their perfectly manicured lawns, watching the chaos unfold. I spotted Mr. Reynolds, one of the few sane people on the block, shaking his head. He caught my eye and mouthed, "She's lost it." Right, Miller sighed. So, let me get this straight. There was an unauthorized power line running from your farm. He gestured to me. To the HOA neighborhood. He turned to Karen. And you're saying this was approved by who exactly? Karen lifted her chin. As HOA president, I don't need to seek external approvals for decisions that benefit the majority of the community. Miller's partner, a younger officer who had been flipping through a small notepad, finally spoke up. Ma'am, do you have any documentation proving the HOA had permission to install this neighborhood infrastructure? Karen opened her mouth, hesitated, then did what all entitled people do when they realize they're cornered. She doubled down. This is not the issue here, she snapped. The real crime is that Mr. Carter has been hoarding resources that should be shared with the community. He has excess electricity and yet he refuses to be a good neighbor and... Ma'am, Miller interrupted, rubbing his eyes, you do realize electricity doesn't work like that, right? Karen's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. I bit back a laugh. Yeah, Karen. I don't just have a bunch of extra power sitting in a bucket out back. Miller sighed. Look, let's make this simple. Mr. Carter, did you give anyone permission to run an external power line from your farm? Absolutely not. He nodded. Then we have a problem. Karen's smugness flickered. A problem with him, right? Miller shook his head. No, ma'am. If what he's saying is true, your HOA illegally tampered with private property and stole electricity. That's theft. Karen made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a strangled shriek. This is absurd. I am the HOA. I don't steal, I manage. This is a misunderstanding at worst. Miller turned to his partner. Run a check with the utility company. See if there've been any unusual reports of electrical tampering in the area. Karen paled. There's no need for that. We should be focusing on his violations. Miller ignored her. Mr. Carter, do you have any evidence of the illegal connection? Sure do. I pulled out my phone and showed them the pictures I'd taken. Close-ups of the trench, the unauthorized cable, and my friendly little note to Karen before I cut the line. It was all neatly hidden under a fake layer of grass. I'm guessing someone hired a crew to make it look professional. The younger officer whistled. Wow. That's a level of HOA interference I haven't seen before. Karen let out a nervous laugh. Let's not be hasty. This was probably the work of an overenthusiastic resident trying to solve our ongoing power issues. The HOA itself is not responsible. Miller gave her a long, tired look. Ma'am, you just said you approved it. I misspoke. Before Miller could respond, another car pulled up, black, unmarked, and carrying the kind of aura that made everyone immediately tense. The door opened and a man in a dark suit stepped out, looking around like he already knew exactly what was happening. Karen stiffened. "Who is that?" I smiled. "Oh, Karen, I think you're about to find out." The man adjusted his tie, nodded at the officers, and then turned to me. "Mr. Carter?" "That's me." He extended a hand. "Mr. Leland, State Agricultural Protection Bureau. We received your report of unlawful interference with a protected farm." Karen's face twitched. "Protected farm?" Leland barely spared her a glance. "Yes, ma'am. Under the state's Right to Farm Act, this property is legally exempt from HOA interference, and any unauthorized disruptions, especially those involving utilities, are taken very seriously." Karen's entire body language shifted from aggressive indignation to something closer to desperation. "But surely this isn't." Miller cut in. "Ma'am, based on what we're seeing here, you and the HOA could be looking at some serious legal trouble." Karen turned bright red. "This is a conspiracy. You're all against me. First my complaints get ignored and now this." Leland glanced at Miller. "How long has this been going on?" Miller exhaled. "Long enough. And frankly, it's about time someone higher up stepped in." Karen made a strangled sound in the back of her throat. Leland gave her a cool, almost bored look. "Miss Davis, the Department of Agriculture will be launching an investigation into your actions. If I were you, I'd start cooperating." The silence that followed was beautiful. And just like that, the night was about to get a whole lot worse for Karen. Karen's silence didn't last long. It never did. Her face cycled through about 4 different shades of rage before she finally exploded. "This is absolutely unacceptable. You can't just waltz in here with your bureaucratic nonsense and start making accusations. I have rights." Leland, to his credit, didn't even blink. "Yes, ma'am. You do. And so does Mr. Carter." He gestured toward me. "Whom you've been repeatedly harassing." Karen actually gasped. Harassing. She clutched her pearls. No, really, she was actually wearing pearls. Like Leland had just accused her of clubbing baby seals in broad daylight. "I am a community leader. A protector of standards and order. What I do is for the good of everyone." Behind her, a few neighbors exchanged looks. A couple of them took a very pointed step away from her. Leland flipped open a sleek-looking tablet and scrolled for a moment. "Miss Davis, we've reviewed multiple complaints regarding your conduct as HOA president. Several of them indicate a pattern of excessive enforcement, questionable fines, and unauthorized rulemaking." He tapped the screen. "You filed no less than 17 separate complaints against Mr. Carter in the past 6 months. All of which were dismissed." Karen huffed. "Because the system is broken. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to maintain proper order when people like him," she jabbed a finger at me, "refuse to respect basic civilized living? This farm is an eyesore. It's disruptive. It lowers property values. And now you're telling me I'm in trouble because I dared to take a stand." Miller cleared his throat, unimpressed. "No, ma'am. You're in trouble because you stole electricity." Karen ignored him entirely, too busy working herself into a frenzy. "This is a conspiracy. It's corruption. It's a deliberate attack against me and the HOA. And I won't stand for it." Leland let out a slow, measured sigh, like a man who'd seen this kind of meltdown before. "Miss Davis," he said patiently, "whether or not you stand for it is irrelevant. What matters is that you and potentially your HOA have violated multiple property laws, including unauthorized utility tampering and harassment of a legally protected farm." Karen's smugness flickered. "Just a little. I was simply advocating for the well-being of the community." Miller's partner, who had been tapping away on his radio, suddenly spoke up. "Just got confirmation from the power company. They flagged an unauthorized connection on their grid coming from this location. Said they were about to launch an investigation before we called." Leland nodded. "Well, that settles that." Karen's eye twitched so hard I thought she might develop a permanent facial tic. "This is insanity. You're seriously going to punish me over this?" Miller gave her a long look. "Ma'am, you dug an illegal power line across someone else's property. That's not just an HOA dispute. That's an actual crime." The color drained from her face. No. No, no, no. This is wrong. This is completely wrong. And then, because Karen had the survival instincts of a malfunctioning Roomba, she turned to the assembled neighbors, arms outstretched like some kind of suburban martyr. You all see what's happening, don't you? They're persecuting me for standing up for this community. For trying to make things better. A beat of silence. Then Mr. Reynolds sighed and crossed his arms. Karen. Stop. Karen whirled on him, eyes wild. Excuse me. You heard me, he said, exasperated. We've all put up with your nonsense for years. You fine people for mailboxes being the wrong shade of beige. You patrol the streets like some kind of glorified hall monitor. Now you're committing actual crimes in the name of community standards. He shook his head. This is ridiculous. Karen's mouth flapped open, but before she could start screeching again, Mrs. Carter, no relation, spoke up from the crowd. You really thought no one would notice their bills going down while his shot up? She gestured to me. How did you think this was gonna end? Karen looked betrayed. Betrayed. Like these people hadn't been secretly hating her for years but were just too scared to say it. You don't understand. If I didn't enforce the rules, this neighborhood would, she floundered for words. Would descend into chaos. Miller raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, the only chaos I'm seeing right now is you getting caught for power theft. Karen wheeled back to him. I demand to speak to someone in charge. Leland, still perfectly calm, gestured at himself. Hi. That's me. No. Someone higher. Someone who will see reason. Leland glanced at Miller. Miller glanced at his partner. His partner sighed and tapped his radio. Dispatch, we're gonna need an additional unit for an HOA dispute turned. Whatever this is. Karen screeched. And that's when the third police car pulled up. This one, however, wasn't just responding to this call. Because the moment the officer stepped out, he gave Karen a long, assessing look and said, Miss Davis. Karen stiffened. Why, yes. We need you to come with us. Dead silence. Karen blinked rapidly. What? Why? Miller, clearly done with this entire night, muttered, Oh, this just got good. The new officer pulled out a clipboard. We've received a report of financial irregularities regarding your HOA's bookkeeping. Karen physically staggered. ***, what? The officer flipped a page. County records indicate multiple missing expense reports and unaccounted for fees levied against residents. His eyes narrowed. We need to ask you a few questions. Karen turned white. Then red. Then white again. No. This is an attack. This is a setup. Miller gave me a look. I just grinned. Karen tried to argue. Tried to rally the crowd again. But this time, no one stepped in to help her. And as the officers led her, shouting, protesting, ranting about conspiracies, toward the waiting cruiser, I leaned against my fence and let out a slow breath. This was better than TV. Karen was still screeching as they loaded her into the police car, kicking up one final dramatic tantrum in front of the entire neighborhood. She flailed, she cursed, she shouted something about *blatant corruption and *small-minded people ruining civilization*. But at that point even the crickets had lost interest. The officer who had just read her the financial misconduct charges looked like he regretted his entire career. His partner, a younger guy with the dead-eyed exhaustion of someone who had already dealt with HOA nonsense one too many times, shut the car door with a little more force than necessary. Miss Davis, he said through the window, ignoring the fact that Karen was still raving like a doomsday preacher. We'll be taking you in for questioning regarding the HOA's financial mismanagement. Pending further investigation, additional charges may be filed. Karen, red-faced and furious, slammed her hands against the glass. This is a travesty, a betrayal. She turned to the neighbors who had all gathered to watch her downfall unfold in real time. Are you really going to let this happen? I fought for you. I protected you. Silence. Then from somewhere in the crowd, a slow, deliberate clap. It was Mr. Reynolds. A second later Mrs. Carter joined in. Then another neighbor. Then another. Within moments the whole block was applauding. Karen's eyes darted wildly between them, looking for even one ally. A single person to step forward and take her side. No one did. She shrieked in rage. but the sound was muffled as the officer turned on the engine. I watched, arms crossed, as the police car pulled away, taking her and her clipboard of doom with it. It wasn't until the last flash of red and blue lights disappeared down the street that I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. "Welp," I muttered, "that took longer than expected." Reynolds turned to me with a smirk. "Did it, though?" Fair point. With Karen gone, at least temporarily, the tension that had settled over the street like a storm cloud finally began to lift. Neighbors who had been cowering under the oppressive rule of the HOA queen started murmuring amongst themselves, like they were waking up from some kind of suburban spell. "So, does this mean we can actually park in our own driveways again?" someone asked. "Can we put up Halloween decorations now? Are we still gonna get fined for breathing too loudly after 9 p.m.? A ripple of chuckles spread through the crowd, but underneath the humor was something else. Relief. A cautious, hesitant kind of hope that maybe, just maybe, the dictatorship had finally ended. I shrugged. "Guess that depends on whether Karen's got a backup plan from prison." "County holding," Miller corrected with an amused snort. "She's not that deep in trouble yet." He tilted his head. "But from the looks of it, she's about to be." I arched a brow. "Financial crimes?" Leland, who had been silently observing from the sidelines, finally spoke up. "Fraud. Misuse of HOA funds. Unauthorized collection of fees." He glanced at the neighbors. "I'd recommend you all request a full audit of your HOA's records." A few people muttered in agreement. A couple exchanged glances that said, "Yeah, we probably should have done that years ago." Mrs. Carter sighed. "I always knew she was up to something. The HOA fees kept going up, but nothing ever changed." "Except the size of her backyard deck," Reynolds grumbled. "And the new landscaping in her yard," someone else added. "And the fact that she suddenly had a brand new SUV last year," another neighbor muttered. "Oh my God," Mrs. Carter said flatly, realization dawning. "We paid for Karen's luxury landscaping, didn't we?" Silence. Then from the back of the group someone yelled, "Asterisk asterisk, sue her. Asterisk asterisk." Leland smiled thinly. "That's definitely an option." I wasn't going to lie. Watching the neighborhood finally rise up against its former tyrant was a little satisfying. I wasn't part of the HOA, but I'd sure as hell been dealing with its nonsense for long enough. Seeing people finally wake up and realize just how much of a con Karen had been running, that was the cherry on top. As the conversation shifted toward next steps, audits, legal action, and who would take over the HOA now that its queen had fallen, I turned to Leland. "So," I said, "I'm guessing this means Karen's officially on some kind of government watch list now?" Leland smirked. "Let's just say, she's going to have a very interesting few months ahead of her." I grinned. "Good." With that, the officials packed up, the neighbors dispersed, and for the first time in a long time my farm felt peaceful. I took my time heading back, pausing at the edge of my property to look over at the HOA neighborhood one last time. Without Karen patrolling like a hawk, it already felt different. Plumber. Better. But as I turned toward the barn, something nagged at the back of my mind. This was Karen we were talking about. She wasn't the type to go down quietly. She'd lost her power, asterisk asterisk for now asterisk asterisk, but I knew her well enough to be sure of one thing. She wasn't done. Not yet. And when she came back, well, I'd be ready.